Fine. Thank you for attending today's seminar. Today's speaker is Dr. Weinanger, a professor of computer and information sciences, psychology, bioengineering, and genomics and computational biology and operations at the University of Pennsylvania. He's a senior researcher with over 300 publications and has supervised 2 dozens of PhD students and is a co-inventor on 10 patents. His current research focuses on using NLP and explainable AI for psychological research. With that being said, I leave the stage to Dr. Unger.
Great. So good to see some familiar names there. Do feel free to interrupt with questions, either by chat or unmute yourselves and talk up if you can. I'm going to present sort of an overview of a bunch of work that a group of us who call ourselves the World Wellbeing Project are doing, trying to understand people through the language they use. And I'll be drawing on lots of people's work, and I'll try and give them credit as we go along. The basic idea of the research, which should be obvious, is that language is mostly used to communicate, and it's used to communicate feelings and emotions, not just facts. And happily, natural language processing is moving away from the old-fashioned only do question answering, do Google searches, to try and actually capture more emotional nuance. But most of the systems are pretty bad. My PhD students just translated, could you help me with this into Chinese, translated it back, and it translates back to English as, can you help me with this? Well, it means the same thing, but it doesn't quite. Could you, can you, subtle differences? And so we're trying to capture some of those language differences at lots of different levels. I'll talk somewhat about messages, single Facebook posts or text messages, where you might look at the emotion in that message that's conveyed. We're looking at conversations as people text back and forth to each other or talk in therapy sessions, sequences of messages. We're looking across people. Take all of the posts from one person. Can you characterize how introverted or extroverted she is? I'll talk about those today. And we're looking across broader things, counties, communities, countries. Can you look at the personalities of different communities? Which I won't talk about today, but works very similarly. Cool. So today I want to look at sort of two halves of this picture. One, analytical. Grab people's language, ask them survey questions. How does the language predict how depressed they will be, how happy they will be, how empathetic they will be? Then we'll turn to a more modern view, less psychological, more computer sciencey, language generation. How do we write code? How do we modify GPT-3, whatever, to generate language that shows some personality? And most of the chatbots today are flat. They're neither male nor female, young nor old, happy nor sad. They're mostly great if you want to order an Uber, but they're not really evincing personality. And for a lot of applications, we'll talk about therapy, it would be nice if the chatbots actually had something resembling personality. Cool. And again, feel free to interrupt with questions. So far, so good. Okay, so the process for the first half, we're going to get a bunch of people, 3,000 for a small sample, 70,000 for a big sample, share their Facebook status with Facebook, consent to us. I turned down Cambridge Analytica when they approached me a long time ago. We'll count the words. We will then give them a survey. Please answer these questions to use us. Let us assess your personality. We'll correlate them and we'll plot them, visualize them. So people who score highly on extroversion questionnaires use what sort of words? Well, and I'll show a bunch of these plots. The size is the correlation. A big word like party or baby or love you, higher correlation. And the color is the frequency. Red words are frequent, blue intermediate, gray are less frequent. Note that my definition of a word is pretty loose. We take anything that looks like a token, and we do some finding mutual co-occurrence. So words like love you that show up together a lot are there. And what does extroversion look like? It's partying, it's babies, it's amazing, it's boys and girls, exciting. And some things are interesting. Extroverts can't wait. Now, not only can't they wait, but there's no apostrophe in the can't, right? This is a different orthography. People are always trying to fix the language, right? Get rid of unusual spellings. No, so with 3 O's, so with 4 O's, those are extroverted. Questions? Is it clear sort of what, because I'm sure a lot of these pictures. Bigger, more correlation, redder, more frequent. Okay, I'm taking that's a endorsement of yes, I'm with you. Introverts, more computer scientists. What are introverts talking about more? Computer, internet, anime, manga, Pokemon. If you look more subtly inside things like drawing and reading, Japanese, Doctor Who, I should like that one. Style of people who are more happy doing things, less energized by big groups. Some different words like apparently, words of hedging, less definitive, more likely to use the word please, right? Differences in terms of what they talk about and how they talk. Could also look at people who are more neurotic, not good. These are people who are at risk for depression. They're swearing, pardon the words. They're sick of things. They hate things anymore. They're lonely and pissed and bloody worse. You can look at what, and these are American samples. We're going to really talk about America today. I've done similar things in China and other countries, but we'll stick to English in America. Less neurotic, or equivalently well-adjusted Americans. What are Americans talking about? Volleyball, basketball, the Lakers, soccer, a beautiful day, sports, snowboarding. Oh, and religion, right? In Christ, blessed, blessing. We know from many studies that religious Americans on the whole are slightly more agreeable, they're less neurotic, they're in some ways more well-adjusted, happier with their lives. Sports was not so widely studied. Interesting question, that there do seem to be big differences of involvement with sports. Cool. Maybe we should be prescribing, if you're depressed, go out there and go see a game with your friends. So how well can we do with language? Giving people's Facebook language to try and predict the big 5 personality traits: openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, neuroticism. We're pretty much as good as asking your friend to fill out the questionnaire for you. So, not too bad. So that's personality. We can also look at depression. Johannes Eichstätt, now at Stanford, when he did his PhD at Penn. Looking at some of the questions that people use to assess depression. Depression has a lot of components, one of which is low mood. I'm often blue. I'm often down the dumps. Another component, another factor found by PCA, factor analysis, I don't feel comfortable with myself. I'm not pleased with myself. I dislike myself, low self-worth. So depression has lots of facets, including somatic symptoms. I have headaches and stomach aches, sleep problems. We don't have time to talk about all these bad things today and how they differ across cultures. It's interesting. In China, much more somatic symptoms. In the US, much more psychological symptoms. But let's ask, what language is used by people who report low mood? People who say, first low self-worth. People who say, I don't think I'm a good person. How does that show up on Facebook? And the answer is, people don't say it explicitly, but they say why. They say apparently, actually, probably. There's lots of hedge words, anymore, anyone. There's a lot of little bit of signal there, which is quite predictive and maybe not quite the words you would have thought. To ask about mood, how do people who are sad, who are reporting on these questionnaires, I'm unhappy with my life. What do they say? I'm alone, right? It's socially normative in the US to say I'm alone. If they say I'm depressed, then in fact, they probably are depressed and have mood depression, but people don't say that very often, right? It's gray. What they're saying is much more, they're swearing, they're feeling things, they're talking about someone or something, they're using words like kill and pain more, and talking about themselves. I don't, am I wish, I'm not, right? Self-focus. So we can see characteristic traits of people who are more depressed, and more depressed in different ways. Well, can we use these same sort of techniques to study personality traits that are less well understood? Things like empathy. There's Annika, our empathetic person, says empathy and trust, now at Facebook, who seems to be interested in trust these days. Can we see how word use captures empathy? Well, same process. Give a few thousand people questionnaires to measure their empathy, and then see what words people who score highly on the empathetic questionnaires do. They're talking about love and feeling and me and my family and I and so much. Sort of weird, we'll come back to that. Why are they talking about themselves? Empathy is about understanding, feeling other people's feelings, but okay, we'll get there. And we can look at LDA topics. Empathetic people are missing other ones. They're XXO, they're kissing them, they're thinking they're loving weird. They're lots of love, missing, cute, single. That's a young one. Cute is a kiss, and single. These are like late teens, early 20s. Empathy. Friends and family. Wonderful, blessed husband. Okay, that's a more 30s and 40s, sort of more grown-up empathy. So empathy looks awesome. Well, but there are whole people. Paul Bloom, right now pulled in as a co-author on our empathy paper, wrote a whole book saying empathy is bad. Very famous psychologist Yale. Why does Paul think that empathy is a bad idea? Well, I think it's more subtle. There's some good empathy, thinking about understanding other people's empathy. There's some bad empathy, actually catching other people's bad feeling. Empathy is good when you think about other people, when it's controlled, when you're not catching their pain, when you're not too upset by it, when you're able to actually help them. But if it's the case that you are catching their pain and getting upset, if you tell me what a bad day you have and I get so upset that I can't help you, not good. So can we ask questionnaires for these two pieces and pull them apart? Yes. So Annika did some nice beneficial empathy questions. I have tender, concerned feelings about people less fortunate than me. That's good. I tend to make other people suffering my own. Probably less healthy empathy. So how do these show up in language? The beneficial empathy, the one that's other focused, looks somewhat similar to the general empathy, but more concerned about the homeless, about people, more religion again, more positivity with great days, more overcoming challenges, strength and faith, still the unconditional love, right? Looks pretty good. This is concern about others. So what's the depleting empathy? What's the empathy where you catch someone else's feelings? This is the part that has the I, the me, the myself. You tell me how bad your day is, and I go, I'm upset about it. It's full of pain inside. It's drama with peoples. It's some nice things, dads and heroes and prouds and mom, and feeling bad about earthquakes and missing one's boyfriend and having friends and being in mood swings. But note that there's lots more of the I, lots more of the want, lots more of the crying in the feeling. And people like Paul Bloom believe that this sort of empathy is not going to make your friend be better. This is just going to make you pulled into their unhappiness. So, are these things real? Yes, they actually correlate with self-reported behavior. People who have the more depleting, I feel your pain, are more likely to give time at the soup kitchen. Those who are more beneficial are more effective altruists. Altruists give money. People who feel other people's pain intensely are more likely to miss work, to drink nights, work nights, less good health, and way more stress. And these are highly relevant to even looking these days at people in helping professions, everything from bartenders to social workers and doctors. If you feel other people's pain too much, it's hard to cope with it. And we can actually get measures from language. Cool. That ends the first half. Let me pause, see if there are any questions, make sure everybody's alive out there still.
Hello, sorry, I'm in a little noisy environment. My name is Christina Lerman. I want to ask you about this depleting empathy. Actually, to me, it sounds more like codependency. For example, when you don't have very clear boundaries between your own feelings and other people's feelings, which is known to be a kind of risk factor for all kinds of psychological problems. Is it the same thing? Is that what you mean by that?
It's closely related. I think the psychologists, and I'm often a psychologist, would argue it's slightly different. So codependency is, I would say codependency expresses a kind often of this depleting empathy. So I don't need to be codependent to have this depleting empathy. If I'm a social worker and every client I talk to, I feel intensely how bad their lives are. When their child dies, I feel terrible. When they're depressed, I feel depressed. So it's codependency is one facet of this, but I think this depleting empathy, or what Paul Bloom calls empathy, goes beyond codependency, that it shows up lots of different cases, right? I don't think a therapist is necessarily codependent on her patient, but she could still either be concerned, compassionate, care about her patient, which is good, or get flooded with emotion, which makes it very hard to be there. So closely related, but I think not exactly the same.
Sure, but I'm just going to throw out there, but the kinds of character traits that lead to depleting empathy might also lead people to become social workers, something, so it's might not be
exactly.
Easy to,
Okay. Yes, so precisely that this trait of being an empathetic person both causes one to become someone like a social worker. My wife's a social worker. I know she's a compassionate person. She cares about others. And it's a professional risk that she needs to disengage from clients sometimes. Otherwise, her life would be as miserable as the people she's trying to help. So very much connected. Thank you. Anyone else? Questions? Cool. So let's shift gears and look at the opposite side of the same question. We've talked about taking people's language from Facebook and recognizing, are they depressed? Are they extroverts? Are they empathetic? Now let's ask, can we take that same sort of approach? Well, it's got to be a little bit different under the hood. And can we generate language that's depressed? Well, maybe for practicing for therapists, can you generate language that's empathetic? I think lots of companies that have their contact centers would love their chatbots to appear a little more empathetic, not just help you find your missing luggage, but feel sorry for you that it's missing. Jal Sadak, one of my collaborators, is working with people in Uganda where women are texting in questions about their physical problems, and some of them are medical problems, but always with medical problems are mental problems in the sense of unhappy, sad, worried. The sort of thing where in the hospital at Penn here, we're trying increasingly, you're diagnosed with cancer, we try not just to treat your cancer and not just to worry about the financial side, how will you pay us, but also to worry about the fact that this is likely to make you unhappy and depressed. Can we provide some sort of support? So the question is, how can we generate language which is empathetic or extroverted or whatever trait we'd like to see? And this is a field that's changing super fast. I think many of you have followed GPT-3 and Palm and Dolly, and there's just like the last few months I've seen a vast number of these incredible natural language models coming out. And the question is, how can we start to use these and control them in some way that they don't just answer factual questions, right? This is the power behind lots of things like search engines, but that they actually have personality, style, empathy, at least appear to have empathy. Cool. So I'll set a couple of examples. The first one, we do at Stony Brook and Andy Schwartz, looking at taking GPT-2, which is easier to get inside of than GPT-3, standard sort of language model, trained up on large amounts of text. Okay, if I had 2 hours, I could cover the self-attention, but we're not going to because you either know it or it's more detailed than you want to know. But an idea that it typically takes in a sequence of words, I love that song, and gives some outputs that says, here's a plausible, reasonably high probability output of a auto-completion, right? These are fancy auto-completion language models because EVM is awesome, it's great. Okay, so we'd like to change this so that we can control it. We want to change its personality. Most chatbots, as I said at the beginning today, really don't have a lot of personality. So what do? We're going to grab the same data set I talked to you before, 70,000 people. They give us their survey responses. We assess their personality. We collect their text. We build, in this case, a Roberta-based prediction model rather than just counting the words. And we now have a model that will label any sequence of text with personality. How extroverted is this sequence of text, right? So it's a standard supervised Roberta-based machine learned model, predict the personality of each text, where the training label is not from the personality of the text, because texts don't really have personalities. The training data is from the person, right? So we take a person, if she's an extrovert, we label all of her Facebook posts as extroverted. Now that's not quite true, but it's a good approximation. We train the model up, right? So we now have a model that predicts how extroverted or introverted each text is, or how depressed or non-depressed each is, whichever we want. But we'll start with personality. Cool. So given that model, we now have lots of labeled text. And what we can do is take the label on the text, and each label is basically a 5-dimensional vector: how open, how conscientious, how extroverted, how agreeable, how neurotic, right? These are the 5 dimensions of the major personality model. We take that 5-dimensional label on the model, and now what we do is we feed it in at all the internal layers. We're using a 12-layer model of GPT-2, and we can now fine-tune the model, do gradient descent, such that it uses the information about the label of the text, its personality, as part of its model. And this allows us, once we've tuned it, to say we will put in whatever 5-dimensional vector, in this case, high extroversion, everything else neutral, into our model once trained, and it will generate as many sentences as we want, which are extroverted. So what does an extroverted generation of sentence look like? Is going to be in the club. Oh, I love my friends. Okay, GPT-2 is not super fluent. We'll do later the more modern versions of things, but at least it's got the catching style of being extroverted, right? Gonna be at the bar for drinks. That's an extrovert move. Had a blast tonight. That's even grammatical and fluent, right? So we've trained a model, a language model, such that we can input whatever we want. And because it's a standard transformer model, we can have it complete any phrase we want. So a sort of nice one to understand it is, I like to. I like to dress up like I'm a model. I like to call it a night with an exclamation point, right? I like to dance. I like to sing. I like to kiss. I like to dance. These models tend to repeat themselves a little hard, right? So you can see that they're catching the personality. They're capturing this. We can also look at introverts playing games or thinking themselves as nerds. Yes, lots of us are introverts. It's pretty common in computer science, taking long walks and listening to music in silence. So we get sort of the flavor. You can do this for any of these personality traits, or for that matter, any combination of them. What do neurotic people talk like? Generating as much text as we want that's neurotic. Really nervous about tomorrow, terrible headaches. I like to think I'm not alone, but I'm so scared of what my future holds, right? Oh, a little unpleasant. So we've got this ability to feed into our model and input what personality traits do we want and have it generate data. Oh, cool. Questions? Let me stop again.
So I was wondering, it seems that you have this label for the sentences when you want to train. How do you like compute or find those labels?
Right, so note the process. We first train a model. We get 70,000 people, but even 3,000 will work. Get a few thousand people, have them fill out a personality questionnaire. So we know that they're extroverted or neurotic or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
And then we take the label from the person, what they did on the questionnaire, and we apply that to every Facebook post they've made. Now that's training data. It's small. It's only a few thousand or a few tens of thousands of people. And though it's a model, we built the model from that. Now we can take any text we want and label it as being extroverted or neurotic or agreeable. So we now have a large set of texts with labels. We can now use these texts as part of the second round of training, which is to take our transformer model and fine tune it so that it now takes as input not just anything, but takes as input, this is in fact the personality that we want to have generate this text. So the transformer models in some sense, of course, are auto-completion, right? They're deleting some words, masking them, repredicting them. But now we're doing that also knowing something about whether the person is neurotic or not neurotic. And if the person is neurotic, they're most likely to be using words like nervous or stressful or headache or terrible or sick, right? Those are all neurotic words. Now we haven't built these in, of course, but statistically, when we train or retrain, fine tune our GPT model, it's going to know that those words that were removed, if it's a neurotic person, are most likely to be these. If the person was well adjusted, they're more likely to be words like happy or to be talking about sports teams or whatever. Makes sense? So we train the model based on having learned these are our inputs, this personality, here's the outputs that we're doing from our model, these texts that show that personality.
Thank you.
Appreciate the clarification. This is super good. These are all things that are brand new. This one's not published yet, nor is the next one. So you guys are guinea pigs. I get to talk about things here. The first half was all published. This half is all, well, except the empathy stuff is still under review because it's psychology. It takes 5 years. Cool. So that's one approach, which is to go in and fine tune the GPT model. A similar different project we're looking at, and we being my student Emma, is trying to say, what can we learn from online peer-to-peer counseling? So it's common in the UK for the National Health Service to have actual therapy given by chat, texting. In the US, the psychiatrists mostly strongly discourage it, in spite of the randomized trials in the UK showing it works. But there are a number of companies that offer online peer-to-peer counseling. You're feeling depressed, you sign up, they will assign you a counselor, usually not a super highly trained one because those are expensive, and they will then talk to you, chat with you. And one of these companies, I don't yet have permission to reveal their names, so I won't, provided us with lots of this data. And so question that Emma asked is, can we find one aspect of what these counselors do based on standard training for therapists? And can we move to automate that process? How well can we do that? And what would work? What techniques work or don't work in contemporary 2022 NLP? And the task she took was reflection generation. And many of you will have heard that a standard thing is if a client says, I feel so anxious when I wake up in the morning, I can't resist having some alcohol. one of the appropriate responses for a therapist is to reflect that back to you, rephrase it. It sounds like it has been a way of calming your anxiety at the start of the day and releasing the tension you're feeling. So note it's not quoting the person back themselves, not something stupid like, I hear you say you're anxious when you wake up in the morning and can't resist having alcohol. It's rephrasing it, and it's giving a little bit of a piece here, but it's also managing to note that you're understanding them, right? Understanding, directing a little bit. So the question Emma asked is, can we build a chatbot that, given a statement from a client, right? One of these people texting this, one of these therapists or counselors, as they call them, can we generate the counselor's responses? Cool. And how do we do it? We'd like it to be fluent, looking like English grammar. We'd like it to actually be a reflection. We'd like it to feel useful. So there are a couple of ways to do this with a system like GPT-3. One option in terms of a prompt, right? GPT-3, remember, is an auto completion thing, like I showed you before. It takes a sequence of words and then just auto completes a whole response. Is to have something where we feed GPT-3 the text, client : and then we put in the message, right? The exact message that the client typed, right? That's our input. And then we type the words, or feed the GPT-3 an instruction, and we type counselor : and we see what GPT-3 types, which is remarkably good, we'll see. Another way to do this is to ask and give GPT-3 a little more knowledge. Give it a bunch of training examples. We give it client : and the message, and then we give the counselor : and the answer that a counselor gave to that client message. We do this a bunch of times. Then for the last time, we do client : the actual message we care, the input, and then counselor : and GPT-3 auto completes. So we have two different ways to prompt, and we can also do fine tuning. Given a bunch of messages and reflections, we can also do a little gradient descent within GPT-3, just like we did with GPT-2 for the last example, to do gradient descent to adjust the weights within GPT-3 to do a better job of actually generating the counselor's reflections from the client messages. Questions before I go on? I want to make sure this is clear. This is also the very first time. These are results from the last week. So these are hot off the, well, not even on the presses yet. Okay, I'm hoping that's clear then. If not, we'll come back to it. So how well does it work? A bunch of bar charts. So let's start with the lower ones. The sort of light blue and green are fine tuning on 350 real reflections, the actual responses given by the clients at this company. Or we have a slightly larger one in the data set. We could find 911 and we tried more of them. It makes no difference, 350 versus 900 labeled client actual real reflection. And both of them work okay in terms of fluency. How much does it feel like English? Not great in terms of the quality of the reflection as assessed by people who are trained in, is this a sort of thing a therapist should say? And asking the assessors, these are skilled PhD students, not great assessments. Okay, so fine tuning worked crappily. What's going on? Well, we look at the actual results that the actual therapists, or they're not therapists, they're untrained counselors gave. They're not super fluent either in their texting, and they're not super good in the quality of their reflections, and they're not loved. So if you take the actual responses given by actual people on an actual live website with real people, they're not really good. And it turns out you could train GPT-3 to have the same crappy performance that the humans have. Oh dear. Okay, let's try a second pass on it. Let's get someone like Emma, who's trained in this, to go back and write good quality responses. What she thinks the counselor should have said, right? And now we can try a couple different ways of inputting this, not with the actual real responses given by counselors, but with what they should have said according to an expert. And what happens? Either you give a few inputs, that second method I gave, or you can fine tune. She only labeled 350 of them, so it takes some time to actually write these responses. Pretty much equivalent and not very far away from pretty much indistinguishable from how good the actual responses are in terms of fluency. And if you look in terms of how good a reflection it is, pretty similar. And you look at overall preference, there's a slight preference for the actual real responses generated by a skilled human. But given the choice of the real responses generated by an unskilled human, the ones generated by trained on, fine-tuned on something generated by an expert, or the ones given by an expert, if you can't afford the real expert, you're much better off having something trained on the real expert than something which was done by or trained on a non-expert. I think what we're seeing here is something that I think we'll see a lot in these systems. I'm predicting an enormous, this is a multi-billion-dollar market coming across here. It's not going to be just sex bots and game playing things or contact centers. There's going to be lots of things talking to you. And in general, it's going to be true for a while that getting a really good human is going to be good. We're not going to replace excellent teachers and excellent therapists with bots. Not there, but there's an awful lot of stuff being done by not so skilled humans. And the bots trained on the experts are going to be performing a lot better than the bots trained or the actual humans who are not as trained. So big differences, right? A whole point difference on a 5-point Likert scale, where training on good inputs allows it to generate things that are indistinguishably fluent in terms of how Englishy does it sound, unlike the GPT-2 examples I gave you, and indistinguishably good in terms pretty much of reflection. Still to be figured out, but this is only last week's data. Okay, people still like the real stuff from the real people a little bit better. Why? I don't know. We're trying to work on it. Cool. Questions? Good. Well, let me move toward wrapping up a bit. Where are we going in this broad big picture?
Sorry,
Yep,
there's a
please.
question.
Oh, great. Excellent.
So do we know anything about the time multitasking pressure on the less trained counselors to hammer out responses?
We don't know much about the time. It is the case that the counselors are acting in real time. So this is a live chat session. And we do know that the expert generated responses were not generated in real time. The expert ones that I did was an expert sitting down and she had infinite time to craft them and edit them and redo them. Whereas the counselors are, this is an excellent point. The counselors are working in real time knowing that there's a human sitting waiting for them. So it's definitely, that's a good question. Can we get some timings on these? But it's definitely going to be the case that the real counselors are going to be much more time pressured than the expert generated responses. Nice point. Thank you. Any other questions? That was super helpful. Okay, so where am I going next? And the World Wellbeing Project. We're looking at how language differs within people. If you're texting your friends versus your family, we're getting people to share their text message with us. How do you text differently? How do different cultures use language differently? In China, Japan, Mexico, India, and the US will be the first ones, but at the moment, mostly in China versus the US. There's a minor technical detail, of course, that the messaging in China is generally in Mandarin, and the messaging in the US is mostly, although by no means entirely, in English. And so one has to do some controlling for the fact they're different languages, but it's also the case that the style is different. The ways, the level of politeness communication in Japan is not surprisingly way more subtly expressed than the English. And the way people talk about depression is really different across different cultures, certainly across China, India versus the US. I think I mentioned before, much more somatic in Asia, both East and West Asia. Headache, stomach ache, go to doctor, versus in the US, much more psychological. Sad, unhappy, not enjoying my friends anymore, go to psychiatrist, right? Different perceptions of these represented differently in language, which lead to both problems potentially in diagnosing people from language and opportunities in trying to customize and identify treatment across different cultures. We're moving away from just texts and overall all the language of a person to conversations. We're having text messages where now you got to consent more, both sides of the conversation, paying people to hold a conversation and talk about a newspaper article, and then measuring how empathetic do they think they are, how empathetic are they perceived by the person they're talking to, grabbing, as I showed today, therapy conversations. Moving in these things to saying then, can we not just analyze them, the first half of today, but can we actually generate them or transform them? I want a Grammarly for style, not just in a superficial style thing, but something that makes the text warmer and more friendly. My friend Angela Duckworth, she always, all her texts are warm and excited and smiley faced and exclamation points, and you're so wonderful. And it's like, darn, I wish my text could be like that. Why is my phone not smart enough to take my texts and shift them styles to be a little bit more like Angela's? Why is it that I don't have something that can take my brief messages to my wife and make them a little longer, fill them out as if I weren't in a hurry, make them feel more empathetic, right? There's lots of cases. It would be nice to have something that was an automatic adjustment that shifts conversational text in the right direction, preserving the meaning, preserving the intent, but doing the thing I would have typed had I had more time to stop and think about it rather than being rushed. And there are lots of cases, not just selling products, but in terms of therapy and trying to help conversations about vaccination. We've been looking a lot at vaccine hesitancy. Zhao is building, along with IBM, a chatbot has built, it's live, I can give you the link for it, where you can chat questions about vaccines that you have. And one wants not only for the vaccine chatbot to give the correct medical answers, checked by medical physicians, clinicians, but you'd also like them to have a little bit of empathy when it's appropriate. You'd like them to understand something about motivational interviewing, which doesn't have the chatbot saying, "You didn't get vaccinated, you idiot, how dumb are you?" Probably not the right response. And a lot of systems we find when we train them on things like Reddit, lo and behold, when our chatbots are trained on Reddit, they rapidly become a little bit abusive because Reddit's not always the friendliest place on the web. It's not the worst by far. These are even moderated places, but it's still the case that our Reddit trained chatbots are not something that IBM would feel comfortable publishing for good reason. How do we take these sort of methods and guarantee that as one builds chatbots to answer questions, that they remain respectful, they remain concerned about other people, they actually try to hold conversations that listen, and that they don't go off the deep end and start becoming unnecessarily nasty, as so many of the training data sets do. And with that, thank you. 1 million people behind this work. This is probably, you got 30 papers maybe today. Thank you for your patience. Thank you for the questions. And in fact, I will stop sharing in case there are more questions.
Thank you so much. Any questions? Okay. I personally kind of like the topic a lot, although it is not my focus. So we have a question.
Yeah, emojis and emoticons. Yes, in our current work, everything is a word. So in my world, whether it's an exclamation point or a smiley face or sick of, those are all words. And absolutely, it is the case that we have written whole papers on, for example, how emoticons differ between the US and China, mostly the same, but some subtly different. Chinese seem to have more subtle attention to the facial gestures there, a little more nuance in their use of facial emoticons. But I think the bottom line is that when you get text, everything is part of the text. And I didn't show examples of emoticons. Our early stuff didn't have it. The conversations that are using for these chatbots don't use a lot of them. But I do think that they are one more piece of text. And sure, they're a key way that people, particularly younger people, encourage and express their emotions through a chat medium. Really depends a lot on whether you're doing SMS versus Twitter versus Facebook. I showed today mostly Facebook and therapy. And in those cases, there's a lot less emoticons than there is in Twitter or SMS. Do I think there are any ethnic? Can you mean ethnic, not ethical? Because they're two different things. There's ethical concerns and there's ethnic concerns. The ethical concerns relate the over one. Ethical, first of all, a lot of these pieces here methods can be used for discrimination in a variety of ways, and often can be used incorrectly. So I think a lot of the ethical concerns tie to the cultural differences. In the extreme case, there are companies out there selling products that say, take a video recording of this interview and we will automatically analyze your video recording and determine if you're a good corporate fit. And those mostly are somewhere between fraudulent and evil. Your quality of work is not determined by how good you are at doing the right sort of smiling for the camera. And I think a lot of that is true if you try and do naive assessments of people through their text. I think there are privacy issues. When are you allowed to collect and use, or when are you ethically able to do that? I think there are accuracy measures that are concerned. It's easy for these systems to go bad in weird ways. They can go bad, I mentioned, in generation. They can become abusive, but they can also go bad in the sense that how a word is used and what it means depend upon the context and who's using it. And take an extreme example, obvious, the N-word. If you use that word, does that mean that you're a racist? In our data, the answer is no. It means you're an African American. If you're going to label people who use the N-word as being racists, you're now throwing out African Americans. So there's a lot of more subtle questions. We study alcoholism, stigma. If I say you're a drunk, what does that mean? And the answer is it really depends on the context. If you're at AA, it means we're being honest, we're close friends, we trust each other. If it's someone to a stranger on the street, it's probably an insult. And so I think there's a lot of ways that it's easy to ignore the context of who's saying what to whom. These systems on average work reasonably well, but there are large pockets where they fail rather miserably. And I think a bunch of companies are going to continue to get in trouble by not having carefully vetted, is this product only on average good, or is it good across enough different subgroups of the population and different situations that we're not embarrassed by it? So I think there are huge ethical situations and questions, and that people need to be really careful rolling these things out. Good question.
Mm-hmm. This brings into mind kind of continuation that, what is the ethics of making individualized predictions? Like people will be tempted to use this language and apply to diagnose individuals. So maybe you can expand on this, like kind of using this for diagnostics of depression, for example.
Yeah, so I would like to see this rolled out for high-risk groups. The first one I would do is pregnant women who are at risk for depression, with clear consent. Who gets to see the results? Does it go to you, to your doctor? Do you have a partner that you would like to share it with? So clear opt-in. I've been also approached the same way. I turned down Cambridge Analytica years ago when I didn't understand where they got their 50 million American Republicans Facebook posts, which they said they had. I've been approached by reinsurance companies that would like to use this to decide how much insurance to charge people. I don't want to do that. So I think on a consenting basis, there's lots of cases where you're being seen by a therapist, or most Americans are not seen by therapists when they're depressed. They're seen by their general practitioner, their doctor. Most of the antidepressants in the US are prescribed by doctors who don't have a lot of time to worry about your depression status and check how it's doing. I could see opting into some monitoring system that might be a useful piece to do. But note that it's got to be clear consent. It's got to be a clear benefit to the person being monitored. And it's got to be very clear questions of who does that. Now, we're really careful in the US about sharing medical data, HIPAA. I don't see any reason we couldn't be equally careful about sharing information about depression for these pieces, but it's got to be put in a way that's well regulated. Way too easy to do things that are and should be illegal. Oh, you look depressed, I don't want to hire you, right? Oh, I'm going to charge you more for your insurance because you look like you're a high risk because you're depressed, right? So there are places it can be used and places where hopefully laws will be careful to protect people who should be protected.
All right, thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, other questions? Okay, I guess.
Cool. I
all-
thank you all. I'll see a number of you later today, and it will be fun.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you. Very interesting talk.
Good.
Thanks.
Glad you enjoyed it.
Bye.
Thanks. Bye-bye.